Another thing that will periodically fail is you have your corner wiper, right? This extends and retracts. There's a sensor here with a light. When it's retracted, that light should be on. I've seen these get torn, ripped, damaged, and then it won't read, and then the sealer won't do anything because it thinks it's still extended. If you break glass, I've seen sometimes like glass will get bedded in this, so it won't fully retract. So you might have to just take this off and clean that out. This clear air lines here, that is not nylon. That's called FEP tube. It's a high temperature tube. These, they'll eventually spring a leak and you'll have to replace them. They have some coming for spare parts. These orange cables here are also another wear item. These orange cables will break. So if you're looking on the screen here, if you go to axis status, we go to heater status screen, we can see our actual temperatures of where everything is at. So like up on that pivoting point of the head, we got, our upper nozzle and our wiper, and then on the lower head, we got the lower nozzle and the lower wiper, right? If you see these temperatures maxed out, like let's say 1500 degrees or really a high limit, it's usually an indicator that either your RTD is bad or your cable is bad. Or if you find that you're just taking forever to get up the temperature, it could be a bad heater. I would say the first place you should look, unless you actually see damage, if it's one of the heaters, like because you got your nozzle and wiper heaters are all on this block, right? Your nozzles are on this side, your wipers are on this side. If it's one of those that's either not heating up or it's reading high limit or not reading anything, check your cables. It's a very good chance these cables are bad. These cables run through this loop here, right? So as this head twists, this always is moving. And these cables, they might not look damaged, but the wire breaks on the inside. It's a relatively common thing. So check those, especially if like you're not reading or it's reading high limit and you can grab this and move it and all of a sudden it's reading, definitely the cable. As far as heaters and RTDs are concerned, like this one with this big square head, that's an RTD, right? Temperature sensor. Then you have these other ones that have the same kind of cabling, but it's got a little tiny round head. Those are your heaters. If you're replacing, there's various heaters and RTDs throughout all this, right? There's some heaters here, some heaters here, some heaters and RTDs down here. They're all over the place. As you replace heater, all the RTDs are identical. They're all the same. Heaters, there's 200 watt and 300 watt heaters. When you replace them, look in the on the wiring diagram. It gives you a 3D model of this, essentially like a picture, and it tells, and then right above it, it'll tell you which heaters go where. So make sure they end up in the same holes with the right wattage of heater. Another common place, if you start getting a lot of sealant pouring out the back here, like you get a lot of sealant pouring out here on the nozzles. If I open the head and I pull the nozzle out, a really common place of failure is either that O-ring. There's like a Viton O-ring on that nipple. You can kind of see it. It's right in there. And there's another O-ring in that hole. This one lasts a lot longer. This one tends to get torn sometimes, or operators will drop the nozzle and mushroom this top over. If the top's mushroomed over, maintenance needs to replace this block. If it's just the O-rings cut, put a new O-ring on it. This, when you close it, like when you close the nozzle assembly and clamp it, you'll feel a little detent. Down the road, that's going to wear and it's going to get loose. Then you just need to look and determine, is this these hooks that are worn out, or is it the pins that it rides on is worn out? When that happens, replace the appropriate parts. You don't want that loose because you don't want the head coming open when it's running. Underneath here, we have a swivel. We also have two swivels on the back, on the left side of that block back there. they will eventually start leaking when they do replace them. Another thing that keep in mind, like eventually these gauges are going to freeze up and they're not going to work anymore. When you replace the gauge, and then you also have a pressure sensor here. If you have to replace that pressure sensor, fill them with grease and then put them in. If you fill them with grease, it'll prevent sealant from getting in there, and they typically last longer. They will fail eventually, but they will last a lot longer if you fill them with grease. Otherwise, just general stuff up here. Keep your lugs clean. These lugs get grooves in them. You can see some grooving in them. They will get a lot worse. Replace them as needed. You should always have plenty of those on hand. All right. On the back, eventually, like you have metering pumps. You got 4 metering pumps. There's one in behind this insulation blanket. There's another one over on that side. And then there's 2 up here, right? Eventually, those pumps are going to start leaking sealant. The first place they typically leak is you're going to start sealant ooze out the back here into this coupler. It's important that when that starts leaking, you get another pump on order. If you ignore it, eventually sealant will work all the way at the back and it'll wreck the gearbox too. And then the cost just went through the roof. So replace the pump when it starts leaking, and then you can send these pumps in and get them rebuilt. Then you'll have some spares for next time. Don't let it work its way back into the gearbox. Another point, like down here, there's another coupler, and there's a coupler on the top head here. So this, we'll go to the bottom head just because it's easier to see. This block here, that's just in front of that coupler, that's called an H block. There's seals in there. That's where everything pivots, right? Eventually, if that starts leaking out in between there, you're going to need new seals. I would just get a complete H block, put it in, and then you can rebuild the one that's there and throw it on the shelf for a spare. Side note on the heaters, like when you take that apart, you might find that there's more holes where like heaters and RTDs can go in than there are RTDs and heaters in there. Make sure they end up back in the right holes. All the heaters and everything, and even those orange cables that run back, run into these connectors here and then up here. You take this connector apart, there's just a little flathead screw for getting the heater out. You can replace it. It's not that hard to do. Your sealant valves here. So right here, you got a sealant valve here, here, and then there's 2 on the bottom head. If you look in here, in this gap, where this big like brass nut is, where the rod runs in and out of, if you start to see sealant coming out of there, just give that bolt or give that nut like an 1/8 inch turn. Don't go very much, maybe an 1/8 inch, and watch it for a while and see if it continues to leak. There's a packing in there. If it still continues to leak, give it another 1/8 inch. It'll eventually quit leaking. If really you crank that down and it just keeps leaking, you'll probably need to replace that. But typically just give it an 1/8 inch turn will reseat the packing and then they quit leaking.